Hey, everybody, welcome to Crackpot, the podcast where each and every week we dive into a different conspiracy theory and we discuss the merits or the demerits of each. We're your hosts. I'm Tim.
And I'm Zach.
Howdy, Zach.
Welcome back, dude.
Thank you.
I heard we have a pretty cool topic today.
I got tired of you always taking the good episodes and leaving the chaff for me, right? Separate the wheat from the chaff and I get the chaff.
Yeah.
I think is how it works.
I don't want to elaborate on that, but anyways, we'll say breadcrumbs.
Breadcrumbs. Yeah, you just left me with the breadcrumbs.
Yeah, here I am eating the whole loaf of bread.
Yeah, so there is nothing I like more than a good reincarnation story.
Oh, really? You?
Oh, yeah.
No kidding.
Oh, absolutely. What are you talking about?
I didn't know you were into
I love it. I love it.
Huh.
I have no explanation, and I always just have to sit there and be like, I don't know.
Dude, I get it. I can't get enough of these stories either. It's hard to find good source material that's like credible.
Exactly. So I listen to currently one podcast very irregularly, but it's Mike Clelland's podcast, Hidden Experience. It's fantastic. And it's basically just long form interviews with people in the paranormal, UFO, everything that kind of universe. And he brought on Mary Harrison, who talked about a story from her book, The Children That Time Forgot. You can find it on Amazon pretty cheap. I enjoyed it. It's just kind of a collection of reincarnation stories. I don't know what else to call it. It's children that can remember their past lives.
This is where it's weird. It's when it's like the kids, especially when they're very young, remembering very vivid or certain experiences.
And we've talked about this. We've had some really interesting cases that you brought up that we've talked about. And it's like, yeah, there is clearly something going on. The parents are confused. The authorities are confused. Everyone's confused. No one knows how this child got this knowledge, but they clearly have it. And what do we do with that?
I mean, that's kind of it.
The best one that we talked about that I remember was, you might remember the details, but a kid, a small boy who remembered his life as a World War II fighter pilot.
Yeah, it's like Jacob Leininger or something like that. Yeah. So the kind of the broad strokes of that one are, there was a boy 3-4 years old when he was very young. He kept telling these stories. Like it sounds ridiculous when I say, but he was a kid, so he couldn't really talk a lot about the experiences. But he'd say like, crash, bang, ow, and he'd draw all these pictures of essentially like an airplane getting shot at.
Yeah.
And then he would talk very openly about how he remembers like crash landing in the ocean.
Yep.
And they did a bunch of research. The family thought it was just kind of odd. Maybe he saw a movie or something like that. Yeah. But they went back and corroborated some of the evidence against what he was talking about, and it turned out to be true. Yeah. So it just kind of leaves you to your point earlier, like, well, what are we dealing with here?
Stuff like the tail number on the airplane and his co-pilot in the back seat, they were able to trace down and figure out who this actually was. Anyway, that's not the point.
Very specific details.
The point is, like, there's a lot of these stories, and I just find them endlessly fascinating. What I was able to do with this book, I went through and I picked out examples of when a child could remember a past life, but the past life was also in the same family unit that they were born into. So essentially, like a relative or a family member passed away, and then the child was born and seems to have the memories of that person who had passed away.
Dang.
So I don't know if there's a name for this or what it is, but it's this just bizarre little niche of stories I came across, and I just absolutely couldn't get enough. So the thing to remember with all of these stories that I'm talking about today, none of them involve any hypnosis. None of them involve any sort of age regression or anything like that. These are all fully conscious memories that children bring up. And when I say children, I'm talking about ages 2 to 3.
Yeah.
Every single kid in this book is not older than 4. Most of them are about 2 to 3. And all the memories seem to stop when they reach about 6, which is very consistent across the board. The other thing about this is none of the parents or guardians in this book or any of these stories I'll be mentioning believed it. at first. They were all highly skeptical. They were all incredibly hesitant to believe the kid or to look into it further or to just plain think about what this actually meant in the broader scheme of things. So to me, it's the best of all the worlds.
That's what makes these so interesting.
All right, so I got a couple, and we'll talk through them. This first one is definitely my favorite. It's kind of complicated, and you'll see why real quick, but we'll try to break it down for you here. So we are talking about a little girl by the name of Mandy Seabrook. Baby Mandy was born. This is sometime in, I want to say, the early to mid-70s. And she seemed healthy, but after a short while, they found out that she had a double hernia behind her heart. She got better, but then unfortunately she got worse after she caught a bad cold or an infection or something, and complications just being what they were, she ended up passing away very young, still an infant. When she was born, she had this single lock of hair, like a little curl on her forehead. And when she passed away, she was, I think, like 5 or 6 months old when she passed. She also had half a tooth poking out of one of her gums in her mouth. Now, this family, mom and dad, they also had a 4-year-old sister at the time when the baby passed. But given the magnitude of what the family was experiencing, unfortunately, the parents decided to split. Mom took the oldest daughter, and she remarried. So her name is Gillian, the mom. And she remarried George, who also came from another family with someone who had passed away just kind of coincidentally as well. So the two of them, Gillian and George, they had 4 kids. Wendy, Sean, John, and their youngest, Mandy. So she had another daughter, and when they had a different name picked out, when this baby girl was born, she looked at her and she's like, oh no, we can't name her this. She looks exactly like my little baby Mandy that passed away those years ago. If it's okay with you, I want to call her Mandy. It's just going to be easier. So George is like, great, it's Mandy. Now, the thing that these two parents decided was that they were not going to tell their children about their past families or the tragedies that occurred in their past families. So there doesn't appear to be any sort of cross-communication going on that way. So anyway, you got baby Mandy. We'll call her Mandy 2. Mandy 2 is born. When Mandy 2 turned about 2 years old, the family was driving down the M1. The mom was sitting in the front seat, had little Mandy on her lap. All the other kids are in the back seat. Dad's driving. They go past a cemetery. And little 2-year-old Mandy kind of pokes up and she says, look, Mommy, that's the place you put me in the ground that time. And then you nearly fell on top of me. Do you remember? And the parents kind of look at each other and they're shocked, to say the least. And they're like, what are you talking about? I don't know. And she's like, yeah, you put me in the ground that one time. And they're like, no, nothing like that ever happened. And again, they never talked about this with the other children. So those other children wouldn't have talked to little baby Mandy about this either. There was simply no way that she could have known. They ask her a few follow-up questions. And Mandy goes on to describe the bracelet that she was wearing when her mom, quote, put her in the ground over there. And she's like, okay, tell me about this bracelet. She said, well, it was a silver bracelet and it had crosses on it and it had words engraved on it. And the mom said, well, do you remember what the words said? Which is a crazy thing to ask a 2-year-old who can't read, trying to figure out if this 2-year-old might actually be a 5-month-old reincarnated who also probably couldn't read.
Right.
But nevertheless, the girl says, yeah, it said, to darling Mandy from Uncle Patrick, but I don't have an Uncle Patrick. Who's Uncle Patrick? Uncle Patrick was her first husband's brother.
That's wild, dude.
Yeah, all of that completely checked out. To expand on the rest of that story, the mom at the gravesite was obviously heavily grieving and distraught, and her physician put her on some medication to help her get through the period of time, and she was just kind of woozy and tripped on some loose dirt and honestly almost fell in, someone caught her, and the rest is the rest. But how do you explain that?
There's a lot of layers to this.
Yeah.
There are. So, okay. I mean, number one, classic reincarnation story.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no explanation involved.
Right.
Another possibility, and this is something I've heard about in other reincarnation type stories, is this like collective consciousness, right? Maybe the trauma or the event left an impression upon, I don't know, like the world.
Yeah, sure,
And
right.
some sort of consciousness,
Some sort of
carried over.
psychic impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Beyond that, dude, I really can't say.
Same, man. Absolutely same. When Mandy was 3 years old, she saw a kid in a wheelchair, and she went up to her dad and she said, just so you know, Steve's okay. He can walk now. And her dad says, I'm sorry, what? Who's Steve? She's like, well, little Steve. Her dad, George, in his previous marriage, had a boy named Steve who had died and also had cerebral palsy.
Wow.
And she was saying, don't worry, he can walk again. But she had absolutely no way of knowing these things because the parents that was the past. They put it away. They didn't talk about it amongst themselves. They certainly didn't talk about it to their kids. But nevertheless, little Mandy knew that Steve was okay now and could walk.
Wow.
When she was 5, she just out of the blue asked her mom, she said, hey, why did you bury me with a small yellow pom-pom? Which, first of all, if a kid ever asked me that, I don't even know how I would respond. But anyway, why did you bury me with a small yellow pom-pom? And her mom's like, well, look, I know you've had these stories before and maybe they're memories, maybe they're not, but this is just categorically not true. Like, that the baby I buried had no small yellow pom-pom with it. And they were talking about this, and the mom ended up asking her oldest daughter, who was 4 at the time of the first child's death. So the thing to remember about that is the 4-year-old did not go to the funeral. The parents decided not to have the kid go there. She wanted her baby sister to have something to do in the afterlife or whatever this child was thinking. So she took one of her little yellow pom-poms. She's like, yeah, I put it in there. I put it underneath her so no one would see it and pull it out. And yeah, I absolutely did that. I haven't thought about that in 10 years or something.
That is not fair. That's just not fair.
So it's like a double blind.
It's even more than that. It's like triple blind because you have the experience with the mom, the bracelet, the sister. I want to go back to the comment she made about the brother Steve that she wouldn't have known about.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, could he walk because he was in the afterlife and could walk? Had he reincarnated and she knew about it and he's able-bodied now in some way? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
There's actually a million questions even with that.
Right.
So it's too much. It's too much. I quit the show.
Well, the last point on this particular story here is, so Mandy asked her mom one night, this is shortly before she turned 6, and like all these other, it's like something happens when these kids turn 6, like the memories just turn off. I don't know if it's because they go to school or because they can't remember that far back or what it is. But anyway, the point is, she asked her mom, do you remember the bright star in the sky the night that I died? And by now her mom had just kind of accepted that maybe this kid was the same kid and so on and so forth. And she's like, yeah, I do remember that. She's like, I walked up to the top of the steps and I looked out the window and there was just a really extraordinarily bright star kind of on the horizon. And I looked at it for a while and I didn't really know what to think about it. And I haven't thought about it since, essentially. And Mandy said, oh, that was my star. That was my way of telling you that I was going to come back.
Ooh. Dude, that's crazy. That's really special, though. That's something else.
I know.
That's something else.
So what is going on? is reincarnation real? Maybe it is. Maybe something's happening. But I like what you said as well, like this idea of like a collective consciousness. Maybe she's, as a small child, tapping into these shared memories, perhaps, which is just as equally woo as talking about reincarnation. I get that. But, you know...
I don't know, man. I think the more I look into reincarnation and the idea of, the spirits returning or whatever is going on, it does actually seem to kind of make sense in a lot of ways.
In a lot of ways, it kind of does. All right, let's go to our next person. This is Kelly. She was 2 years old, and she remembers maybe being her own grandmother.
I like this.
Okay, so she was 2 years old. And her aunt came over to her house, and she was sitting on her aunt's knee. Her mom and her aunt were talking, and she just kind of, doing what a 2-year-old does, and then just kind of pipes up, and she says, "Do you remember when you used to sit on my lap like this?" And everyone laughed. Oh, honey, you're so funny. She's like, no, like... And then, they explain, no, that didn't happen. You're 2. No one could sit on your lap. And she's like, no. This was a long time ago. You, and she's talking to her aunt, she's like, you kept your hair in a Cleopatra style and I would comb it for you. 2 things to mention about this. First and foremost, yes, this was actually a thing. Her aunt had a Cleopatra hairstyle and her mother would comb it for her when she sat on her lap. Secondly, what 2-year-old has ever even heard of a Cleopatra hairstyle?
I was going to say that's very specific.
It is very specific.
Uh-huh.
That's bonkers.
Oh.
Okay. So anyway,
Yeah.
So this all happened about 20 years ago with their grandmother. Anyway, so Kelly, this is the child here. She kept talking about how her aunt had a freckled face and would wear her favorite red and white polka dot dress, which was, again, completely true. And like the 2 of them, the mom and the aunt, they were like searching the house, like trying to find a photograph. Like clearly this kid saw a picture in a photo album, on the wall, in someone's wallet at some point, and is referencing this. And that's where they're getting... Could not find anything. There were no photographs anywhere of these girls at this time, especially wearing a red and white polka dot dress. So like, where did that even come from? The 2 women would also remark, after this all came to light and people started wrestling with whether or not this may or may not be true and the ramifications thereof, but they would notice that this little girl would sit in the same way that their grandmother would sit, where she would like put her purse between her leg and the chair and then just kind of like sit off to the side and place her hands a certain way in her lap. And it's just like her mannerisms, her actions, the way she just holds herself were all nearly identical to the grandmother. This small child developed a fascination with Victorian clothing. And she would start talking. I think she's about 3 or so years old at this point. She started talking about how she loved more than anything. Her favorite memory was when she lived all by herself in this tiny little bungalow. And, they're like, she never did that. That's not true. Like, Grandma never, she never lived alone. She never lived in a bungalow. Like, where is this coming from? And then they start going through their records and their photos and talking to people who, were friends with the grandma at this time. There was a 2-week gap between when she moved out of her original house and when she moved into her new house with her husband, where she lived in a bungalow all by herself, completely 100% independent every single day. And yeah, that was, again, a real memory that this kid could have no way of knowing.
Completely, totally corroborated. Yeah, and it's not just like, it's not something that would be vague enough or broad enough. Like, right. I miss Christmas morning. It's like, well, right. Okay.
Remember when you used to make me pancakes?
Yeah.
And then we would go sledding?
Right. This is like incredibly specific.
Yeah.
Even the Victorian era clothing is fascinating to hear about.
It's just bizarre. So to cap it all off, one of the grandmother's old friends came over to visit with Kelly's mom. They were chatting and talking, and Kelly, the little kid, she's just kind of in the same room doing her own little thing, not really paying attention necessarily. And the grandma's friend was talking about a holiday vacation that she took many, many years ago, and just kind of talking about how much fun it was and the memories and all that stuff. And Kelly, she just pipes up. She goes, "Oh, I remember that. That was the year we had a plague of ladybirds." Now, ladybirds, for those of you who don't live in the UK, they're ladybugs, which are those little black and red insects that come out every summer or so. Anyway, this woman was absolutely shocked and confused, and she goes, "How does she know about the ladybirds?" And the kid, without missing a beat, she goes, "Well, I knew it was the same year as the ladybirds because when you went on that holiday on the seaside, you wore that big funny hoop thing under your dress to make it stand out more. And your mom and I, we just would tease you about it day and night. You remember that? We called you a walking bell tent." And the grandma's friend just completely dumbfounded, like, all of this is true. How does anyone know this, let alone a 2-year-old?
There's no explanation here.
I'm waiting for something, man.
The more I look into this stuff, too, it's just, you're kind of stuck with maybe it's real.
Yeah.
Or what else besides the collective consciousness thing, that isn't even proven. So
yeah,
it's all just unproven, but very real-ish.
I mean, the flip side of the coin is everyone's making it up. They're all stories, and everyone's lying to get attention. Which, sure.
Okay.
Some people could be lying. Some people could be telling stories.
Sorry. So what you're saying is like the family's saying that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the only
possible.
other explanation I can think of outside of a woo kind of idea. But, you know, I have not personally talked to these people. I didn't interview them. I didn't corroborate the stories. I can only go based on the interview I heard with the author, who sounds like an incredibly intelligent and competent person, and the book, which seems very well put together and well researched. I mean, I don't believe that these families are making this stuff up.
No, I don't think so. That is why it is so freaky.
Yeah. All right, let's jump now to a young Desmond Sanderson. So Desmond's aunt had a stillborn child about 7 years before Desmond was born, and unfortunately, right around the same time, her husband was killed in an automobile accident. And no surprise to probably anyone, this woman had a nervous breakdown and went through a lot of very heavy, deep stuff, and the family collectively decided that they would just not ever talk about any of it again. So there's that. Okay. Then along comes Desmond at 3.5 years old, who told his mom, "You know, Mommy, I went to Auntie before I came to you, but I didn't stay that long." And she's like, God. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" And he told her that he remembered everything quite clearly when he was with her. He said it was very warm, and it was, quote, quite bouncy. He said, "I used to turn around and around all the time. I loved turning around, and I felt very happy and very comfortable and very wet. It was always dark, but I wasn't frightened. And then the author says, it all seemed perfectly natural to him, and it seemed like a great ideal place." And he said, sometimes I would go to sleep, and then I'd wake up, and I'd do it all over again. And one time, I just went to sleep, but when I woke up again, I wasn't with Auntie Ruth anymore. And his mom says, "Okay, where were you?" And he said, "Oh, well, I went home, of course." And she kind of uncomfortably chuckled and said, "Well, what do you mean by home?" And he said, "Well, the place that I lived in before I went to Auntie Ruth, where it had all the nice fields and all the other little boys and girls would play, I went back to be with Robert and Samantha." The names Robert and Samantha, it doesn't mean anything to me specifically. Maybe there's someone else out there who has come across other stories of a Robert and a Samantha. I would doubt that those names are collective across cultures and so on. But what are these guardian figures that kind of watch over these children in this in-between place. That is a common theme across time and across cultures. He went on to say that with the other children, the other boys and girls there, they would play games. They would race boats up and down the river. The boats were decorated with flowers, and there was no wind, but the boats would just go anyway. Occasionally, people would stop by and play music, and they would sing songs. The children loved playing in the water. Everyone loved the water, but you couldn't get wet. It was water, but it didn't make you wet. So do with that what you will. They were also given fruits to eat. He said his favorite was a giant plum-like fruit that was larger than a plum and had no pit. And he would talk about this stuff on and off until he turned 6 years old and never brought it up again.
What do you do with that, my friend?
What do you do with that? So this introduces the idea of this actual, I don't want to say physical, but for lack of better terms, let's just call it a physical place between birth and death, I guess. That's not necessarily an afterlife. It's more of like a waiting place.
Yeah, I've heard of this as like a spirit realm.
Yep.
And yeah, the idea is that for whatever reason, that's where like souls are waiting to be reincarnated.
Yeah.
And people have memories. Kids specifically sometimes have memories of that.
Yeah. I don't know. I laugh because I don't know what to say. Okay, let's jump to our next one here. Little Richard Williamson, 2.5 years old. Richard's grandfather died 9 months before Richard was born. I think you can see exactly where this is going. So the family was sitting around just kind of reminiscing about Grandpa. Little Richard, 2.5-year-old Richard, was in the room, not really paying attention, but they were telling a story about a time when the grandfather was building something or fixing something and he hurt his hand. And telling this story. And Richard pipes up and he goes, "Oh, my hand was sore that time." And they all laughed and chuckled. They're like, "Oh, Richard, you mean Grandpa's hand was sore?" He's like, No, my hand, it was sore. And they're like, "Well, did you hurt it today? Like, what's wrong with your hand?" He's like, No, the time from the story, my hand really hurt." And he held up his right hand and he pointed to the webbing between his index finger and his thumb. And he said, "Right here, it really hurt." Wow. And that's exactly where his grandfather tore the webbing on his hand and had to have stitches, which was not part of the story that they were telling. I don't need to tell you that, but it's implied. That was not introduced, but this kid was like, "Oh God, my hand hurts so bad."
It makes no sense. It's so specific, right?
Right. Okay. Fast forward a couple months later. He's 3 now. The family moves to a new town, and they're not even there for a week, right? And little Richard, he's all excited, and he goes out one morning with his mom, and they're walking around. He says, "Mom, I want to go to York Road today. Take me to York Road." And she's like, "I have no idea where York Road is. I can barely find the post office. What are you talking about? How do you even know there's a York Road? Where did you hear this?" He's like, No, there is a York. I want to go there. I know. Follow me. I know how to get there." And the mom's like, "I am not following a 3-year-old in a new town to a street I've never heard of. This is patently absurd. I won't do it." But the kid just kept pestering her and wouldn't stop. So they walk into town or whatever, and she goes into a shop and she's like, "Hey, I'm new. I'm looking for York Road." And the shopkeeper's like, "Oh, sure. What you want to do, you got to go down there, and then you got to hang a left at the place, and then you walk until you see the big tree, and then you go right, and you can't miss it. It's at the end of the lane," that sort of thing. And she thanks him, and she's like, you still want to go? He's like, yes, I want to go. And so they start walking, and the kid's like, I know a shortcut. Like, we don't have to take those directions. I know a way to get there faster. And at this point, she's like, fine, whatever. So follows the kid. Sure enough, knows a shortcut, gets to York Road, and he stops there, and he just kind of like walks up and down this block stretch, just looking into each and every shop. And he does it like 2 or 3 times, just slowly going back and forth. And the mom is like, what are you looking for? Like, what can I help you find something? He's like, I'm just looking for the old shop where I used to buy my cigarettes.
Oh my God.
Which is exactly what you want to hear from a 3-year-old, by the way. But he finally gave up, and, come to find out, obviously the town and the street had changed multiple times over the last 60 or some years or something, and that old shop no longer exists, and it's now a laundromat or something like that. But she was just absolutely flabbergasted, because how could you know this stuff?
That is so cool.
It is so wild. So when the grandfather passed away, he had remarried. And his second wife came over to visit the kids and the grandkid and everything like that. And when she walked in one of the first times, this kid looks at her and like knew her name right away, just started talking to her. And I don't have any specific instances or stories or anything that I can share, except that this woman said that he had the same mannerisms as the grandfather. He had the same speech patterns. He had the same sense of humor. And the two of them just like they got along famously.
This is not uncommon in these reincarnation type stories, where it's not only do they have these memories, but they physically behave in a manner similar to the person that's passed, which it also doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But it corroborates, I guess, the idea that perhaps it's the same soul.
Yeah. It's you're the same person, and I guess you're trapped with the same emotions and mannerisms and sense of humor no matter what you do.
Well, I'm lucky.
Right.
I'm in good shape, right,
Hit
folks?
the jackpot.
Yeah, there we go.
But I mean, reincarnation, this is a weird and touchy and tricky topic for us to talk about. And I'm just going to call it out and put the cards on the table here right now. Zach, you're in my conversation, and our framework around this really comes from an upper Midwest Christian background.
That's correct.
So both of us born and raised in Christian households in America, where reincarnation is not really part of the cultural norm. But of course, in many, many parts of the world, it is.
Exactly.
So, I mean, the reason I bring that up is when we talk about it, we say this is crazy, there's no explanation, it's bonkers.
Yeah.
There are probably 1,000 people listening in that are like, no, that makes perfect sense. None of this is shocking at all. That's how it's supposed to work. And I totally respect that, because it's like, hey, maybe science is pointing in that direction too. But just to kind of give you a breakdown here. So world religions, I checked it out. Depending on what source you look at, there are somewhere between 4,300 and 10,000 recognized major religions in the world. And I mean, we're talking about everything from Aboriginal Native peoples' religions to giant organized things like Christianity. But if you just look at the big four, the big four make up 77% of the world's population. And by the big four, I'm talking about Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism. They're the most populous religions. Like I said, 77% of the world's population are there. But Christians, Zach, do not officially believe in reincarnation. Probably not shocking news to you or most other people listening to this.
Right.
However, it was a point of debate up until the year 553 AD, when the Fifth Ecumenical Council convened and decided that the scripture and the teachings and the gospel really only pointed to heaven, hell, and this idea of purgatory that the Roman Catholics decided to run with. and that was it. You really get one shot, and that's it. You don't get to do it over and over again. End of story. However, early Christians, we're talking the first couple centuries, tended to believe that reincarnation was a possibility.
That is striking.
Yes.
And you wouldn't think that. But it does point to the fact that people even back then must have had something to go off of to believe it, you know? So the idea didn't just fall from the sky.
Exactly.
They probably saw things like this, observed similar things, and thought, oh yeah, this is a real thing.
Exactly.
Huh.
There was a survey done in 2009 of American Christians. I think it was Gallup that did this poll. 25% of American Christians in 2009 believed in reincarnation. So if you do consider yourself a Christian and you do think that this is possible, you're in some good company, I guess.
Yeah, you're not alone.
You're not alone. And I mean, without getting into breaking down scripture and that sort of thing, it is interesting because Matthew and Mark, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark specifically, talk about how John the Baptist was Elijah, the prophet Elijah, and Jesus was the second coming of Elisha. So I'm not I'm not saying that they were reincarnated, but it's interesting that is baked into the scripture as well.
Well, it kind of turns the whole thing on its head because you would say, yeah, it's strictly forbidden. We don't even talk about it.
Yeah,
but actually, in fact, maybe they did.
Oh, they kind of did. And there's some interesting scriptures that make a lot more sense if you look at it through that framework. But anyway, okay, well, let's talk about Buddhism, of course. Now, Buddhism, believe it or not, does not believe in reincarnation. They believe in rebirth. And I could spend 40 hours researching and 20 hours talking about it, and I still couldn't give you a good answer as to which is which. So I'm just going to take some liberty and call them kind of the same thing. So rebirth and reincarnation. The interesting thing about Buddhism goes back to that story we talked about earlier where that person had that location in between death and birth. Buddhists have 6 bardos. Have you ever heard of the phrase bardo? Yeah. William Saunders wrote a book not too long ago called Lincoln in the Bardo, which is maybe where some people have heard of this. But bardos are different realms. Now, there's, like I said, 6 of them. Birth, the act of being born, you're in a bardo. When you dream, it's a bardo state. Meditation is bardo. And dying has 3 separate bardos within it. One of them is the moment of death. One of them is basically like the visions and auditory phenomenon that people sometimes bring back. And then there's the actual transmigration of the soul when it passes from this bardo to the new body here on earth. So, long way of me saying that organized religions that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, like, talk about everything we mentioned earlier, and they're like, yep, this checks out. This is completely in line with our teachings and our belief. So do with that what you like.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't new stuff.
No, it's really not, but it's still incredibly fascinating. If you look at Islam, one of the other big 4, they do not believe in reincarnation. They believe that at death, you will either go to heaven or hell. What I didn't know, Zach, is that hell is only temporary in Islam. They feel that an omnipotent, all-benevolent being would eventually forgive you. So they say, yeah, you might spend a long time there, but you'll eventually repent and be forgiven, more or less. However, there are some Sufi texts that do talk about reincarnation under the Islamic framework as well. It's not the main broad strokes of all Muslim people, but it is there. Judaism, there is some belief in reincarnation if you start looking at the Kabbalists and like mystical Judaism. There is some idea of reincarnation that's involved there. Again, not necessarily quote unquote mainstream or orthodox or Reformed Judaism. Hinduism, every person comes back to Earth many, 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 many times in order to balance their karma. So the idea of reincarnation is very relevant and very upfront with Hinduism. Interestingly enough, Hinduism, Buddhism, the 2 oldest of these, believe more in reincarnation than the others. Obviously we don't have time to go through all 10,000 world religions, but ancient religions, indigenous, aboriginal, across the world, across cultures, across continents, across times, believe in this idea of dying and then coming back, which is so fascinating.
Well, it also suggests, and kind of getting back to what I said earlier, it's like maybe there is something to this because people have been observing something that leads them to think this is real for a very long time.
Exactly. So I have one other story here that doesn't tie into the whole family reincarnation idea, but well, okay, let me just talk here. So this is Daniel Jones. He was 2.5 years old, and he was talking to his mom, and he said, "I had to go into the water to get born, Mommy." His mom's like, I'm sorry, what? No, actually, she said, "Oh, that's nice, dear." Classic mom. You're like, sure you did. And he said, "Yeah, it wasn't the same as the sea, though. It was a river." And she's like, "Oh, really? Where was this?" Just kind of
playing along.
2-year-olds talk.
Of course.
They tell crazy stories sometimes. You just need to entertain them and go with it. And she said, "Where was this?" And he said, "Oh, well, it was heaven, of course." And then she finally goes, "What are you going on about, Danny?" And he said, "Well, heaven, where all the little boys and girls live before they go to get born." And she kind of stops for a second. She's like, "Oh, this is strange." And she's like, "Well, where is this heaven?" And the child answers, "Well, it's where the river was before I was born." She's like, "Well, okay, how do you know that it was heaven?" And he said, "Well, that's the name that everyone gives it here, but when we were there, we didn't call it anything. We just lived there." Which, again, I think is really, there's a lot to unpack in that small little phrasing there. But when he was just about 4 years old, he was talking to his mom and just kind of mentioning that there were all these other kids there. And they were all really good friends, and they would just spend their days playing with each other and just having a great time. And he said the river flowed through this place, and when it was time for any of the children to be born, they would be led to the river with all of their friends around them, and then they would either jump into the water themselves or else someone else would push them in. And Daniel remembers when it was his turn to be born. He said he went to the water with all of his friends, and his friends were leaving with him that same day. And he said some of them jumped in. He was pushed in specifically. And he said that he wasn't sad or scared because he knew, he was told that he would find all of these friends with him once he got to Earth. And his mom said, "Well, who are they? Have you met them?" He's like, No, I haven't met them yet, but I'll know who they are when I meet them. But what I found so fascinating about that, and a couple of the other stories I mentioned, and a lot of the other stories I didn't mention, is this idea of there being water in this location. This idea of there being a river or a lake or a sea or something where these kids would play, or where they would refresh after they were tired and exhausted from a previous life, or where they would enter into the new life. And I was thinking about this, and I guess what kind of comes to mind culturally when you hear about death and water and a river?
Well, definitely like the river Styx, crossing over that into the underworld or the afterlife.
Into Hades, yeah. So the ancient Greek myth, we'll say, about this fairy man who takes you on a boat, a journey across a stretch of water to another realm, another side. Now, get this, the ferryman of the dead, he's considered a psychopomp, which add that to your vocabulary, folks, by the way. Psychopomp. It is a being in the afterlife that directs and guides you to the next location.
Sure.
They can be spirit animals, they can be relatives, they can be the ferryman that crosses the stream. Anyway, the idea of this ferryman of the dead, 30,000 years old. This crosses cultures and continents more than almost anything. They trace this back to like the Indo-Chinese region. And even then, they don't know where it came from necessarily, but from there, many other religions spawned and were born. But we mentioned this river Styx. There's Slidir, the Norse River of the Dead. There's a Hindu River of the Dead. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. There's Sanzu, the Japanese Buddhist River of the Dead. The Chinese concept of Hong Kong. The Indian concept of Vatarini. And it goes on and on and on. And part of me has to sit back and go like, well, maybe it's not just a story that a bunch of people came up with independently. Maybe there were these people a long time ago and even present day that remember this journey across the water, something having to do with water, and they come back and they tell it. And then look where we're at.
And we forgot it all these years later.
I know,
unless we're, talking about it now, basically. But I think there's something to it. What it is, I don't know. But there's something there. Ugh.
It's so cool. It's so fascinating. I mean, obviously, it doesn't get much bigger than talking about, life and death and the meaning of life and what comes after life and, what happens when we die and all that stuff. But short of someone actually being able to die and come back to life and tell us what's going on, we're kind of reliant on these stories, and it is wild. Whether it's a small child remembering something, or it's someone passing away at a ripe old age that suddenly sees a light in a tunnel and they're surrounded by loved ones. Like, these stories and themes are so baked into our collective conscious that you have to wonder, is this actually the truth?
Mm-hmm. So how does it make you feel? More comforted? More freaked out? Worse?
I'm a little upset that I might have to do this all over again. I'm just kind of tired. No, I mean, I don't really worry necessarily about the afterlife. I think of it as a big mystery, and I'm excited to find out what it is and not really anxious to get there. So if it's being reborn, then hey, sounds cool to me.
It's just all crazy. Like, I don't know how I feel about it other than I'm endlessly fascinated.
All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in this week and listening. If you have time, if you'd like, we have another way to help support the show. You can head on over to our Patreon. Zach, where can they find that?
Patreon.com/crackpotpodcast.
Check it out. It is fantastic. And sign up there for as little as $3 a month. You will get every single episode we've ever put out, plus another bonus show every single week, all ad-free. It's wonderful. We also have a couple other little treats and tricks and things up our sleeves, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, before you do that, please rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your local ferry operator about our podcast. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.